The ancient stone walls of Raven's Hollow Castle had witnessed many secrets over the centuries, but none quite like what was unfolding in the private wing on this cold October evening. Princess Charlotte, barely 7 years old, pressed her small face against the ornate window of her bedroom. Watching the storm clouds gather over the kingdom, her golden curls bounced as she turned away from the window, tears streaming down her rosy cheeks. "I want to sleep," she whispered to herself, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit closer to her chest. The rabbit, named Sir Whiskers, had been her constant companion since she was 3, a gift from her late grandmother, Queen Isabella. Its once pristine white fur was now faded and worn from countless nights of comfort and countless adventures through the castle corridors. The private wing of Raven's Hollow Castle was supposed to be Charlotte's sanctuary, a place where the young princess could escape the rigid protocols and endless lessons that filled her days. The wing consisted of her bedroom, a small sitting room, a private bathroom, and a study where her tutors would come for individual lessons. The walls were painted in soft pastels, decorated with paintings of fairy tales and magical creatures that her mother, Queen Victoria, had specially commissioned when Charlotte was born. But tonight, the sanctuary felt more like a prison. Charlotte had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the voices from the adjoining room. The voices belonged to her new governess, Miss Thornfield, and her assistant, Miss Blackwood. They had arrived at the castle 3 weeks ago, sent by the Royal Education Council to oversee Charlotte's studies and daily routine. Miss Thornfield was a stern woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun and glasses that seemed to magnify her disapproving stare. She wore only dark colors, blacks, deep purples, and navy blues, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades molding young minds into proper royal behavior. Miss Blackwood was younger, perhaps in her 30s, but equally rigid in her approach. She served as Miss Thornfield's second-in-command, ensuring that every minute of Charlotte's day was accounted for and productive. The two women had transformed Charlotte's once peaceful wing into what felt like a military academy. They had rearranged the furniture to be more educationally appropriate, removed many of Charlotte's toys as distractions, and established a schedule so strict that Charlotte barely had time to breathe, let alone play. From her bed, Charlotte could hear Miss Thornfield's voice clearly through the thin walls that separated her bedroom from the governess's temporary office. "The princess's progress in mathematics remains unsatisfactory," Miss Thornfield was saying to Miss Blackwood. "Tomorrow we'll extend her arithmetic lessons by an additional hour and reduce her recreational time accordingly." Charlotte pulled her covers over her head, trying to block out the sound. She had always struggled with numbers, finding them confusing and boring compared to the stories her mother used to read to her before bedtime. But Queen Victoria had been away on a diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Eldermere for the past month, leaving Charlotte in the care of Miss Thornfield and the castle staff. "Furthermore," Miss Thornfield continued, her voice growing sharper, "I've noticed the princess has been displaying entirely too much emotional behavior during lessons. Yesterday's tears during penmanship practice were completely unacceptable. We must implement stricter discipline measures to ensure she develops the stoic demeanor befitting her station." Charlotte's heart sank even further. She remembered yesterday's penmanship lesson all too well. Miss Thornfield had made her practice writing the same sentence over and over. "A princess must always maintain perfect composure." When Charlotte's hand cramped after an hour of repetitive writing and she had accidentally smudged the ink with her tears of frustration, Miss Thornfield had made her start over completely. "Perhaps we should inform His Majesty about implementing a reward and punishment system," Miss Blackwood suggested. "Negative behaviors could result in the removal of privileges, such as dinner in the main hall with the family, or access to the castle gardens." Charlotte gasped quietly under her blankets. The gardens were her favorite place in the entire castle, where she loved to chase butterflies and pick flowers for the kitchen staff. The thought of being banned from the gardens made her stomach twist with anxiety. King Edmund, Charlotte's father, had been supportive of Miss Thornfield's appointment, believing that his daughter needed more structure and academic rigor in her education. He was a kind man, but often preoccupied with matters of state, and he trusted the Royal Education Council's recommendations. He had no idea how harsh the new governess's methods had become. As the conversation in the next room continued, Charlotte tried various strategies to fall asleep. She counted sheep, recited the fairy tales her mother had taught her, and even tried the breathing exercises that the castle's chaplain had shown her during their weekly sessions. Nothing worked. Every time she began to drift off, another sharp comment from Miss Thornfield would jolt her awake. The castle's ancient heating system creaked and groaned, adding to the cacophony of sounds that kept Charlotte alert. The October wind howled through the corridors, rattling windows and causing doors to slam shut unexpectedly. Even Sir Whiskers seemed unable to provide his usual comfort as Charlotte tossed and turned in her canopy bed. Around midnight, Charlotte heard Miss Thornfield's voice again, this time even more irritated than before. The princess's performance in today's history lesson was abysmal. She couldn't even remember the dates of the Great War, and when I questioned her about the significance of the Treaty of Golden Shores, she actually had the audacity to ask if we could talk about something more interesting. Miss Blackwood made a disapproving clicking sound with her tongue. Such impertinence cannot be tolerated. I suggest we wake her early tomorrow, perhaps 5 o'clock instead of 7, and begin the day with a comprehensive review of everything she failed to learn today. Charlotte's eyes flew open in horror. 5 o'clock was earlier than even the kitchen staff began their work. The castle would still be dark and cold, and she would be exhausted from her sleepless night. She clutched Sir Whiskers tighter, feeling tears beginning to flow again. The young princess had always been a sensitive child, but the last 3 weeks under Miss Thornfield's strict regime had been the most difficult of her 7 years. She missed her mother desperately, longed for the warmth and understanding that Queen Victoria brought to their daily interactions. Her mother never made her feel stupid when she struggled with difficult concepts, never spoke about her as if she weren't a real person with feelings and fears. As the night wore on, the conversation in the adjoining room showed no signs of ending. Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood seemed to have an endless supply of criticisms and plans for improving Charlotte's education and behavior. They discussed everything from her posture during meals to her tendency to daydream during geography lessons. I've also noticed that the princess has formed inappropriate attachments to some of the castle staff, Miss Thornfield was saying. She's far too friendly with the kitchen maids and spends entirely too much time chatting with the gardeners. This familiarity is unseemly for someone of her rank and must be discouraged. Charlotte felt her heart break a little more. Mrs. Pemberton, the head cook, had been like a grandmother to her, always saving special treats and listening to Charlotte's stories about her dreams and adventures. Thomas, the head gardener, had taught her about different flowers and plants, sharing his love of nature in a way that made learning feel like play rather than work. The princess tried once more to fall asleep, pulling her pillow over her ears and squeezing her eyes shut, but sleep remained elusive, chased away by the ongoing critique of her character and abilities coming from the next room. The voices seemed to grow louder with each passing hour, as if Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood were deliberately trying to torment her. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Charlotte had reached her breaking point. She sat up in bed, her cheeks flushed with exhaustion and frustration, her nightgown damp with perspiration despite the castle's chill. She looked around her room, taking in the changes that Miss Thornfield had made, the removed toys, the rearranged furniture, the additional desk where she was now required to complete extra assignments each evening. This had once been her safe space, her refuge from the formal world of royal duties and expectations. Now it felt cold and unwelcoming, more like a classroom than a bedroom. Even the fairy tale paintings on the walls seemed to mock her with their depictions of happy princesses and magical adventures, reminding her of how different her reality had become. Charlotte made a decision that would change everything. She climbed out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor, and walked quietly to the door that connected her bedroom to Miss Thornfield's temporary office. She could still hear the women talking, their voices as sharp and critical as ever. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte raised her small fist and knocked on the door. The conversation stopped immediately, followed by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. After a moment, the door opened, and Miss Thornfield stood there in her dark dressing gown, looking down at Charlotte with surprise and displeasure. "Princess Charlotte," Miss Thornfield said, her voice cold and formal even in the middle of the night. "You should be asleep. Return to your bed immediately." Charlotte looked up at her governess, her blue eyes filled with tears and determination. "Please," she said, her voice small but clear. "I can't sleep." You're talking too loudly and I can hear every word. I've been trying to sleep for hours, but you won't stop talking about me." Miss Thornfield's expression hardened. "How dare you eavesdrop on a private conversation? And how dare you leave your bed without permission? This is exactly the kind of unacceptable behavior we were just discussing." "I wasn't eavesdropping," Charlotte protested, her voice beginning to tremble. "I was trying to sleep, but you're so loud and you keep saying mean things about me. I just want to sleep. Please, can't you talk somewhere else?" Miss Blackwood appeared behind Miss Thornfield, both women looking down at Charlotte as if she were an unwelcome intruder rather than the princess in her own home. "This interruption proves our point perfectly," Miss Blackwood said to her superior. "The child has no respect for boundaries or appropriate behavior." Charlotte felt the unfairness of the situation wash over her like a cold wave. She had done nothing wrong except ask for the basic consideration of being able to sleep in her own bedroom, yet she was being treated like a criminal. The exhaustion, frustration, and loneliness of the past 3 weeks suddenly overwhelmed her, and she began to cry in earnest. "Please," she sobbed, her small body shaking with the force of her emotions. "I just want to sleep." "She won't let me sleep. Please, I just want my mama." The sound of Charlotte's desperate crying echoed through the private wing, bouncing off the stone walls and carrying down the corridors. In the distance, she could hear the heavy footsteps of the night guards beginning to respond to the disturbance. But Charlotte was beyond caring about protocols or consequences. All she could think about was her desperate need for rest and the overwhelming feeling that she was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Captain Marcus Blackwood of the Royal Guard was conducting his routine midnight patrol when he heard the sound that would haunt him for weeks to come. From somewhere in the castle's private wing came the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing. Not the brief tears of a scraped knee or a nightmare, but the deep, desperate crying of someone pushed beyond their limits. Marcus had been a member of the Royal Guard for 15 years, ever since he was 18 years old. He had worked his way up from a simple guardsman to captain through dedication, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the royal family. He was particularly protective of Princess Charlotte, whom he had watched grow from a tiny baby into the spirited 7-year-old she was today. The captain was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind brown eyes and prematurely gray hair at his temples. Despite his imposing physical presence, those who knew him well understood that he had the gentle heart of someone who truly cared about others. He had grown up as the eldest of 6 children in a farming family, and he understood both the importance of discipline and the need for compassion when dealing with young people. Marcus had noticed changes in Princess Charlotte over the past 3 weeks. The bright, curious child who used to greet the guards with enthusiasm and pepper them with questions about their duties had become withdrawn and subdued. She no longer skipped through the corridors or stopped to chat with the castle staff. Instead, she walked with her head down, clutching her books tightly, and rarely smiled. The captain had mentioned his concerns to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, his second in command, but they had both assumed it was simply an adjustment period, as Charlotte got used to her new governess and more rigorous academic schedule. Neither had imagined that the situation had deteriorated to the point where the princess was crying desperately in the middle of the night. As Marcus hurried through the castle corridors toward the source of the crying, he was joined by 2 other guards, Sergeant William Hayes, a veteran guard in his 40s who had served the royal family for over 20 years, and Corporal Elena Rodriguez, a newer member of the guard who had quickly proven herself to be both skilled and deeply committed to her duties. "Sir," Sergeant Hayes said as they approached the private wing, "that crying is coming from Princess Charlotte's chambers. Should we investigate?" Marcus paused for a moment, considering the delicate balance between protecting the princess and respecting the privacy of the royal family's personal quarters. The private wing was generally off limits to the guards unless specifically summoned, but the distress in Charlotte's voice made it clear that something was seriously wrong. "We investigate," Marcus decided. "The princess is clearly in distress, and it's our duty to ensure her safety and well-being." As they drew closer to Charlotte's quarters, they could hear voices along with the crying. Marcus recognized Miss Thornfield's sharp tone, but he couldn't make out the specific words. What he could hear clearly was Charlotte's voice, broken with sobs, repeating the same desperate plea. "She won't let me sleep. Please, I just want to sleep." The three guards exchanged concerned glances. None of them had children of their own, but they all understood that a child's sleep was sacred. To deny a 7-year-old the basic comfort of rest seemed not just cruel, but potentially harmful to her health and development. Marcus made a decision that he knew might have consequences for his career. Royal guards were expected to follow a strict chain of command and protocol, but they were also sworn to protect the royal family from all threats, and sometimes, Marcus realized, threats could come from within the castle walls. "Sergeant Hayes, go immediately to His Majesty's chambers and request an audience," Marcus ordered. "Tell him that Princess Charlotte is in severe distress and that the situation requires his immediate attention. Be respectful, but make it clear that this cannot wait until morning." "Yes, sir," Hayes responded, already turning to head toward the king's quarters. "Corporal Rodriguez, go to the communications tower and send word to Queen Victoria in Eldermere. Tell them it's urgent family matter requiring her immediate return," Marcus continued. "Don't go into details, but make it clear that Princess Charlotte needs her mother." "Understood, Captain," Rodriguez replied, hurrying off to complete her mission. Marcus took a deep breath and approached Charlotte's door. The crying had intensified, and he could now hear Miss Thornfield's voice more clearly. She was scolding Charlotte for her theatrical display and threatening additional punishments for her insubordinate behavior. The captain knocked firmly on the door. The voices inside stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of footsteps. After a moment, Miss Thornfield opened the door, looking surprised and annoyed to see the captain of the Royal Guard standing in the hallway. "Captain Blackwood," she said stiffly. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Marcus could see past Miss Thornfield into the room where Princess Charlotte stood in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Behind Charlotte, Miss Blackwood stood with her arms crossed, looking equally displeased by the guard's arrival. "I heard crying from the princess's quarters," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to ensure her safety and well-being." "The princess is perfectly safe," Miss Thornfield replied curtly. "She is simply experiencing the consequences of her inappropriate behavior. This is a private educational matter, and your presence is not required." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his protective instincts fully activated. "With respect, Miss Thornfield, it is well past midnight, and Princess Charlotte appears to be in significant distress. As captain of the Royal Guard, I have a duty to investigate any situation that might threaten the well-being of the royal family." Charlotte heard the captain's voice and felt a surge of hope. She had always felt safe around Captain Blackwood, who had been nothing but kind to her throughout her life. Sometimes he would show her interesting things about the castle's defenses, or tell her stories about the brave guards who had protected her family throughout history. "Captain Blackwood," Charlotte called out, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please help me. I just want to sleep, but they won't stop talking about me. They've been talking for hours and hours, and I can't sleep." Miss Thornfield's face flushed with anger. "Princess Charlotte, return to your bed this instant. And you, Captain, have overstepped your bounds. I will be reporting this interference to His Majesty in the morning." But Marcus was no longer concerned about protocol or potential consequences. He had heard the desperation in Charlotte's voice, seen the exhaustion in her small face, and witnessed the complete lack of compassion from her governess. Something was very wrong in the private wing, and he was going to make sure it was addressed. "Miss Thornfield," Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when dealing with serious security threats, "I need to speak with Princess Charlotte privately to assess her condition. Please step aside." "Absolutely not," Miss Thornfield replied, moving to block his view of Charlotte. "You have no authority in educational matters. The princess is under my supervision, and I will not have my methods questioned by castle staff." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but at that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Sergeant Hayes was returning with news from the king's chambers. "Captain," Hayes called out as he approached, "His Majesty is awake and requests to see you immediately. He wants a full report on the situation with Princess Charlotte." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. King Edmund was a fair and caring father, but he was also a busy monarch who relied on his staff to handle day-to-day matters. Marcus hoped that the king would listen to his concerns rather than simply deferring to Miss Thornfield's authority. "Tell His Majesty I will be there momentarily," Marcus replied. Then he turned back to Miss Thornfield. I suggest you prepare to explain to the king why his daughter has been crying for hours in the middle of the night. She had not expected her methods to be questioned, certainly not by the royal guard, and definitely not in the middle of the night when her harsh treatment of Charlotte would be most apparent. Charlotte, sensing a shift in the dynamic, found the courage to speak up again. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice small but determined. "They took away my toys and changed my room, and they make me study all day without any time to play. And tonight they've been talking about me for hours, saying mean things and planning to wake me up at 5 o'clock tomorrow for more studying." Marcus felt his jaw tighten with anger. The picture Charlotte was painting was one of psychological torment disguised as education. He looked at Miss Thornfield with barely concealed disgust. 5 o'clock? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Miss Thornfield lifted her chin defiantly. Early rising builds character and discipline. The princess has been displaying far too much emotional behavior, and stricter schedules are necessary to correct her deficiencies. Her deficiencies? Marcus repeated, incredulous. She's 7 years old. Age is no excuse for poor behavior and academic performance, Miss Blackwood interjected, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. The princess must learn that royal duties require sacrifice and dedication. These were not educators. They were bullies hiding behind titles and supposed expertise. Charlotte was not a soldier in training or a criminal to be reformed. She was a small child who needed guidance, patience, and above all, kindness. "Captain," Charlotte said again, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "I just want to sleep. I want my mama. Please help me." The plea went straight to Marcus's heart. In that moment, he made a decision that would define his career and his relationship with the royal family. Protocol and consequences be damned, he was going to protect this child. "Princess Charlotte," he said gently, kneeling down to her level, "you're going to be okay. I'm going to make sure of it." Then he stood and faced Miss Thornfield with the full authority of his position. "The princess will be sleeping undisturbed for the remainder of the night. There will be no 5 o'clock wake-up call, no additional punishments, and no further educational activities until this matter has been reviewed by His Majesty. You cannot give orders regarding the princess's education." Miss Thornfield protested, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I can and I will," Marcus replied firmly. "As captain of the royal guard, I have the authority to take any action necessary to protect the royal family. Right now, Princess Charlotte needs protection from a hostile educational environment." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood stood frozen, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation. Charlotte looked up at Captain Blackwood with something approaching hero worship, finally feeling like someone was on her side. In the distance, they could hear more footsteps approaching. Word of the disturbance in the private wing was spreading through the castle, and soon the situation would escalate beyond what any of them could control. Marcus knew that his actions tonight would have far-reaching consequences, but as he looked at Charlotte's tear-stained face and exhausted posture, he knew he had made the right choice. The battle for Charlotte's well-being was just beginning, and Captain Marcus Blackwood was prepared to fight it with everything he had. King Edmund Ravenshollow was not a man easily roused from sleep, but the urgency in Sergeant Hayes's voice had cut through his royal slumber like a sword through silk. When Hayes had knocked on his chamber door with news of Princess Charlotte's distress, the king had immediately thrown on his royal robe and prepared to investigate the situation personally. Edmund was a thoughtful ruler who had inherited the throne from his father 10 years earlier. At 35, he was considered young for a monarch, but he had proven himself to be both wise and compassionate in his leadership. He was tall and lean, with the same golden hair as his daughter Charlotte, though his was now touched with silver at the temples from the stresses of ruling a kingdom. His blue eyes, so similar to Charlotte's, typically held warmth and intelligence, but tonight they reflected concern and growing anger. The king had always prided himself on being an involved father. Despite the demands of his royal duties, he read bedtime stories to Charlotte when his schedule allowed, attended her birthday celebrations, and made sure to spend quality time with her whenever possible. However, the recent diplomatic crisis with the neighboring kingdom of Aldermere had required Queen Victoria's personal attention, leaving Edmund to manage both the kingdom's affairs and Charlotte's upbringing largely on his own. When the Royal Education Council had recommended Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood, Edmund had been grateful for their credentials and experience. Both women came with impeccable references from other noble families and their approach to education seemed thorough and professional. The king had been so focused on ensuring Charlotte received the best possible education that he had perhaps not paid enough attention to the methods being employed. As Edmund made his way through the castle corridors toward the private wing, his mind raced with questions and concerns. Why was Charlotte crying at this hour? What had happened to cause such distress? And why was Captain Blackwood involved in what should have been a simple educational matter? The king trusted Marcus Blackwood implicitly. The captain had proven his loyalty and judgment countless times over the years, and Edmund knew that Marcus would never interfere in family matters without good cause. If Marcus felt the situation warranted the king's immediate attention, then something was seriously wrong. As Edmund approached Charlotte's quarters, he could hear voices engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion. He could distinguish Marcus's calm but firm tone, Miss Thornfield's sharp protests, and underneath it all, the heartbreaking sound of his daughter's quiet sobs. When the king rounded the corner and saw the scene before him, he felt his paternal instincts override his royal composure. Charlotte stood in the doorway of her bedroom, looking small and vulnerable in her white nightgown, her face red and swollen from crying. Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood flanked her like guards, while Captain Blackwood stood facing them with the protective stance Edmund had seen him use when confronting actual threats to the royal family. "What is the meaning of this?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. All parties immediately turned toward the king, and the effect was dramatic. Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood both curtsied quickly, their earlier defiance crumbling in the face of royal presence. Captain Blackwood straightened to attention and saluted. Charlotte, upon seeing her father, let out a sob of relief and ran toward him. "Papa!" she cried, throwing her arms around his legs and burying her face against his robe. "Papa, I can't sleep. They won't let me sleep." Edmund felt his heart constrict as he looked down at his daughter. Charlotte's hair was disheveled, her eyes were rimmed with red from crying, and she was trembling with exhaustion. This was not the happy, energetic child he had kissed goodnight just a few weeks ago. This was a little girl who had been pushed to her breaking point. "Charlotte, sweetheart," Edmund said gently, kneeling down and gathering her into his arms. "Tell Papa what's wrong. Why can't you sleep?" Charlotte clung to her father as if he were a life raft in a stormy sea. "They've been talking and talking about me for hours," she said between sobs. "They're in the room next to mine, and they keep saying mean things about me and making plans to make me wake up earlier and study more. I tried to ask them to be quiet, but they got angry at me." Edmund felt a cold fury begin to build in his chest. He looked up at Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood, who were standing stiffly and looking anywhere except at the king and his daughter. "Captain Blackwood," Edmund said, his voice carefully controlled, "please provide me with your assessment of the situation." Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, I was conducting routine patrol when I heard Princess Charlotte crying in distress. Upon investigation, I discovered that she has been unable to sleep due to Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood conducting lengthy discussions about her education and behavior in the room adjacent to her bedroom." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on Princess Charlotte's account, several hours," Marcus replied. "She also reports that her educational schedule has been modified to include a 5 o'clock wake-up time tomorrow morning, along with extended study periods and reduced recreational activities." The king felt his carefully maintained royal composure begin to crack. 5 o'clock? He repeated, his voice dangerous quiet. Miss Thornfield finally found her voice. "Your Majesty, if I may explain." "No," Edmund said sharply, holding up a hand to stop her. "You may not explain. Not yet." He turned his attention back to Charlotte, who was still clinging to him desperately. "Sweetheart, has this happened before? Have they kept you awake other nights?" Charlotte nodded against his chest. "Not this bad," she whispered. "But they always talk about me after I go to bed. They say I'm not smart enough, and that I'm too emotional, and that I need more discipline." Edmund felt something break inside him. His daughter, his precious 7-year-old daughter, had been subjected to psychological torture masquerading as education. She had been made to feel inadequate and unloved in what should have been the safety of her own home. "Captain Blackwood," the king said, his voice now carrying the full weight of royal command. I want Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood escorted to guest quarters immediately. They are not to have any further contact with Princess Charlotte or access to the private wing until further notice. Your Majesty, Miss Thornfield protested, taking a step forward. Surely you understand that effective education requires discipline and structure. The princess has been resistant to proper instruction, and firm measures are necessary to ensure— Silence, Edmund commanded, and the word echoed through the corridor with such authority that Miss Thornfield immediately stopped speaking. You will not speak unless I give you permission to do so. The king stood up, still holding Charlotte in his arms, and faced the two women who had been entrusted with his daughter's education. What he saw in their faces was not remorse or concern for Charlotte's well-being, but irritation at being interrupted and resentment at having their methods questioned. You were brought here to educate my daughter, Edmund said, his voice growing colder with each word. Instead, you have terrorized her. You have denied her sleep, criticized her natural development, and made her feel unwelcome in her own home. Sir, Miss Blackwood interjected, if you would allow us to explain our pedagogical approach. Your pedagogical approach, Edmund said, practically spitting the words, has reduced my daughter to tears and exhaustion. Your approach has made a 7-year-old child afraid to sleep in her own bedroom. Your approach has failed completely. Charlotte lifted her head from her father's shoulder and looked at him with wonder. Never before had she heard her father speak with such passion about her well-being. For weeks, she had felt abandoned and unprotected, but now she realized that her father had simply been unaware of what was happening. Papa, she said quietly, they took away my toys and said they were distractions. They won't let me talk to Mrs. Pemberton or Thomas anymore because they say it's inappropriate. And they make me sit still for hours and hours, and when I move or ask questions, they say I'm being disrespectful. Each revelation felt like a physical blow to Edmund's heart. The women he had entrusted with Charlotte's education had systematically dismantled everything that brought joy and comfort to his daughter's life. They had isolated her from the caring adults who had helped raise her, and had attempted to transform a bright, curious child into a silent, obedient automaton. Captain Blackwood, who had been observing the exchange with growing disgust, stepped forward. Your Majesty, if I may make a recommendation. Edmund nodded, grateful for Marcus's steady presence in this emotionally charged situation. I suggest that Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood be escorted from the castle entirely, Marcus said. Their methods are not suitable for Princess Charlotte, and their presence here will only serve as a reminder of these traumatic experiences. Miss Thornfield's face flushed with indignation. You cannot dismiss us without proper notice and review. We have contracts with the Royal Education Council, and our methods have been proven effective with countless other noble children. Edmund looked at Miss Thornfield with such contempt that she actually took a step backward. Your contracts, he said slowly, are with me. I am the king of this realm, and I am Princess Charlotte's father. Your methods may have been effective at creating obedient automatons, but they have failed spectacularly at nurturing a happy, healthy child. The king paused, feeling Charlotte's small hand clutch at his robe. She was finally beginning to calm down, her sobs subsiding into occasional hiccups, but she was clearly exhausted from the ordeal. Furthermore, Edmund continued, I find your complete lack of remorse or concern for Charlotte's distress to be deeply disturbing. You stand there defending your methods while my daughter cries from exhaustion and fear. You are not educators. You are bullies who have hidden behind titles and supposed expertise to justify cruelty. Miss Blackwood opened her mouth to protest, but Edmund cut her off with a sharp gesture. You will pack your belongings and leave the castle immediately, he commanded. Captain Blackwood will provide an escort to ensure your safe departure. You will not speak to Princess Charlotte or any member of the castle staff. Any attempt to contact the Royal Education Council about this matter will be met with a full report detailing your unprofessional and harmful conduct. The finality in the king's voice left no room for argument. Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood realized that their positions were no longer tenable, and their futures in royal education were likely over. They had overplayed their hand, believing that their methods would be accepted without question simply because they came with official recommendations. Your Majesty, Miss Thornfield said one final time, her voice now pleading rather than authoritative. We were only trying to prepare Princess Charlotte for her royal duties. The life of a monarch requires discipline and sacrifice. The life of a monarch, Edmund interrupted, also requires compassion, wisdom, and the ability to connect with people. None of these qualities can be developed through cruelty and isolation. You have taught my daughter nothing except fear and self-doubt. Charlotte, who had been listening to the entire exchange, felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. Her father understood what had been happening to her. He was angry on her behalf, and he was going to protect her. The nightmare of the last 3 weeks was finally coming to an end. But even as relief flooded through her, Charlotte was still exhausted and emotionally drained. The trauma of the last 3 weeks could not be erased in a single conversation, and she would need time and support to recover from the damage that had been done. Edmund, sensing his daughter's fragile emotional state, made a decision that surprised even himself. "Captain Blackwood," he said, "please arrange for someone to bring a comfortable chair to Princess Charlotte's bedroom. I will be staying with her tonight to ensure she gets the rest she needs." The unprecedented decision sent ripples of shock through the small group. Kings did not typically spend nights in their children's bedrooms, but Edmund was determined to prioritize his role as a father over his royal obligations. Charlotte looked up at her father with eyes full of love and gratitude. "Really, Papa? You'll stay with me?" "Yes, sweetheart," Edmund said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Papa will make sure you're safe and that you can sleep peacefully. And tomorrow, we'll figure out how to make everything better." As Captain Blackwood moved to escort Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood from the private wing, and servants hurried to fulfill the king's requests, Charlotte finally felt secure enough to close her eyes. The ordeal was over, and healing could begin. The next morning brought with it a sense of profound change throughout Ravenshollow Castle. Word of the previous night's events had spread quickly among the castle staff, though the details remained somewhat unclear. What everyone knew for certain was that Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood had been dismissed in the middle of the night, and that King Edmund had spent the entire night in Princess Charlotte's bedroom ensuring her peaceful sleep. Charlotte awoke gradually, sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows, to find her father reading quietly in a chair beside her bed. For a moment, she wondered if the previous night had been a dream, but the presence of her father and the absence of the usual morning sounds from Miss Thornfield's adjacent office confirmed that everything had truly changed. "Good morning, sweetheart," King Edmund said softly, closing his book and smiling at his daughter. "How did you sleep?" Charlotte stretched and yawned, feeling genuinely rested for the first time in weeks. "I slept really well, Papa. Thank you for staying with me." Edmund leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what was happening to you, Charlotte. I should have paid closer attention to how you were feeling." Charlotte sat up in bed and looked around her room with new eyes. Without Miss Thornfield's oppressive presence looming over everything, the space felt like hers again. The fairy tale paintings on the walls seemed brighter, and even though her toys were still packed away, she knew she could ask for them back now. "Papa," Charlotte said hesitantly, "what happens now? Will I still have to have lessons and tutors?" Edmund smiled reassuringly. "Of course you'll continue your education, sweetheart. Learning is important for everyone, especially for someone who will one day help lead our kingdom. But your education should be a joy, not a torture. We're going to find a much better way to help you learn and grow." Before Charlotte could respond, there was a gentle knock on the door. Captain Blackwood entered, followed by Mrs. Pritt Pemberton, the head cook, who was carrying a breakfast tray laden with Charlotte's favorite foods. "Good morning, Your Majesty, Princess Charlotte," Marcus said with a warm smile. Mrs. Pemberton insisted on preparing a special breakfast for the princess. Mrs. Pemberton, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, beamed at Charlotte. "Oh, my dear child," she said, setting the tray down on Charlotte's bedside table. "We were all so worried about you. I've made your favorite pancakes with strawberries and cream, just the way you like them." Charlotte's face lit up with genuine happiness for the first time in weeks. "Mrs. Santa Rose posted junior capital for 2 weeks. Pemberton, I missed you so much. Miss Thornfield said I wasn't supposed to talk to you anymore." Pemberton's expression darkened slightly. "Well, Miss Thornfield is gone now, and good riddance," she said firmly. "No one should come between a child and the people who care about her." King Edmund stood up from his chair and stretched, feeling the stiffness from spending the night in an uncomfortable position. As he watched Charlotte eagerly dig into her breakfast while chattering happily with Mrs. Pemberton, he felt a mixture of relief and determination. His daughter was beginning to return to herself, but there was still much work to be done to repair the damage that had been inflicted. "Captain Blackwood," Edmund said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately about the events of last night and our next steps." Marcus nodded and followed the king to the sitting room adjacent to Charlotte's bedroom. Once they were alone, Edmund's composed demeanor gave way to the exhaustion and emotional turmoil he had been suppressing. "Marcus," Edmund said, sinking into a chair, "I feel like I failed my daughter completely. How did I not see what was happening to her?" Marcus sat across from his king, choosing his words carefully. "Your Majesty, you trusted professionals who came with impeccable credentials and recommendations. You had no reason to suspect that their methods would be harmful to Princess Charlotte." "But I should have noticed the changes in her behavior," Edmund insisted. "She became so quiet and withdrawn, and I attributed it to the natural adjustment to a more structured education. I was so focused on ensuring she received proper preparation for her future duties that I forgot she's still just a little girl who needs love and support." Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "If I may speak frankly, Your Majesty, being a parent is perhaps the most difficult job in the world, and being a royal parent adds layers of complexity that few people can understand. You were doing what you thought was best for Princess Charlotte's future, and you corrected course as soon as you realized the problem." Edmund appreciated Marcus's words, but the guilt still weighed heavily on him. "What's your assessment of Charlotte's emotional state? How badly has she been damaged by this experience?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Princess Charlotte is a resilient child with a strong spirit, but she has definitely been traumatized by the last 3 weeks. The constant criticism and isolation have shaken her confidence, and she'll need time and support to fully recover. However, I believe that with the right approach, she can heal completely and even emerge stronger from this experience." The king nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about our next steps. First and foremost, Charlotte needs time to recover and remember what it feels like to be a happy child again. I want to suspend all formal lessons for at least a week and focus on activities that bring her joy." "That sounds wise," Marcus agreed. "May I also suggest involving some of the castle staff who have positive relationships with Princess Charlotte? Mrs. Pemberton, Thomas the gardener, and even some of the younger guards who have always enjoyed her company could help provide the supportive environment she needs." Edmund's eyes lit up with an idea. "Actually, Marcus, that gives me a thought. You handled last night's crisis with remarkable skill and compassion. You protected Charlotte when she needed it most, and you understood the situation in a way that I, as her father, initially missed." Marcus felt a flutter of uncertainty. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but I'm not sure I understand where you're going with this." "I want you to take temporary responsibility for overseeing Charlotte's education and daily activities," Edmund said. "Not as a tutor or governess, but as someone who can coordinate her recovery and help me identify the right educational approach for her unique needs." Marcus was stunned. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm a soldier, not an educator. I have no formal training in childhood development or academic instruction." "No," Edmund agreed. "But you have something that Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood lacked completely: genuine care for Charlotte as a person. You see her strengths and potential rather than focusing only on her weaknesses, and last night you demonstrated better judgment about what she needed than any of the supposed experts." Marcus felt the weight of the responsibility being offered to him. "If you truly believe I can be helpful in this way, then I accept the role. But I would want to work closely with you and Queen Victoria to ensure that Princess Charlotte receives the best possible care." "Absolutely," Edmund said. "And speaking of Victoria, I sent word to her last night about the situation. She should be returning from Eldermere within the next few days." Marcus smiled. "Princess Charlotte will be so relieved to have her mother back. Queen Victoria has always had a wonderful relationship with her daughter." Edmund nodded, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. "Yes, Victoria has a natural instinct for balancing Charlotte's need for education with her need for childhood joy. I should have insisted that any new educational arrangements include her input from the beginning." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about the challenges ahead. Charlotte's recovery would require patience, creativity, and a completely different approach to her education. But with the right support system in place, Edmund was confident that his daughter could not only heal from this trauma, but also develop into the compassionate, intelligent leader he knew she had the potential to become. From the bedroom, they could hear Charlotte's laughter as she talked with Mrs. Pemberton about the latest gossip from the kitchen. The sound was like music to Edmund's ears, a reminder of the joyful child he had almost lost to misguided educational philosophy. "Marcus," Edmund said, "I want to ask you something else. Last night, when you heard Charlotte crying, what was your immediate instinct?" Marcus thought about the question. "Honestly, Your Majesty, my immediate instinct was to protect her, not because she's a princess, but because she's a child in distress. I think sometimes we get so caught up in royal protocols and proper procedures that we forget the basic human elements of care and compassion." "Exactly," Edmund said with satisfaction. "That's the instinct I want guiding Charlotte's care going forward. She is indeed a princess with important responsibilities in her future, but she's also a 7-year-old girl who needs love, patience, and the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them." Captain Blackwood stood up as he heard approaching footsteps in the corridor. "It sounds like the castle is beginning to wake up for the day. Shall I begin making arrangements for Princess Charlotte's modified schedule?" "Yes," Edmund replied, also standing. "But remember, the goal isn't just to fill her time with different activities. The goal is to help her remember that learning can be exciting, that she is valued for who she is right now, and that she has people who will support her through both successes and failures." As Marcus prepared to leave and begin his new responsibilities, Edmund felt a sense of cautious optimism. The events of the previous night had been traumatic and eye-opening, but they had also revealed the strength of the relationships that truly mattered in Charlotte's life. The loyal castle staff, the dedicated guards, and most importantly, the unbreakable bond between Charlotte and her parents would be the foundation for her recovery. "Oh, and Marcus," Edmund added as the captain reached the door, "I want daily reports on Charlotte's progress, but I also want to be directly involved in her activities. I've learned that being a king doesn't excuse me from being an attentive father." Marcus smiled and saluted. "Understood, Your Majesty. I think Princess Charlotte is going to be very happy to have her father more involved in her daily life." As Captain Blackwood left to begin organizing Charlotte's new routine, King Edmund returned to his daughter's bedroom to find her finishing her breakfast and excitedly telling Mrs. Pemberton about a dream she'd had, involving talking rabbits and magical gardens. "Papa!" Charlotte called out when she saw him. "Mrs. Pemberton says Thomas has been growing special flowers just for me in the garden. Can we go see them today?" Edmund's heart swelled with love and relief as he looked at his daughter's bright, eager face. "Of course, sweetheart. Today we're going to do lots of things that make you happy. We have some healing to do, and we're going to take all the time we need to do it right." For the first time in weeks, Princess Charlotte's smile reached all the way to her eyes, and King Edmund knew that they were going to be okay. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Raven's Hollow Castle had transformed into a place of renewed warmth and joy. Queen Victoria had returned from her diplomatic mission to find her daughter slowly healing from the trauma inflicted by Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood. The Queen's return had been like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, bringing with it the maternal wisdom and compassion that Charlotte had desperately missed. Queen Victoria was a remarkable woman who had successfully balanced her duties as a monarch with her role as a devoted mother. At 32, she possessed an elegant grace that commanded respect in political circles, but also a warmth and intuition that made her exceptionally gifted at understanding her daughter's needs. Her dark hair was always styled in sophisticated arrangements befitting her royal status, but her green eyes held the same spark of curiosity and intelligence that Charlotte had inherited. When Victoria had first seen Charlotte after her return, she had immediately understood the depth of damage that had been inflicted. The confident, chattering child who used to greet her with endless stories and questions had become hesitant and anxious, constantly seeking approval and apologizing for normal childhood behaviors. It had taken all of Victoria's self-control not to track down Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood herself to demand an accounting for their cruel treatment of her daughter. Instead, Victoria had focused her energy on helping Charlotte heal. Working closely with King Edmund and Captain Blackwood, She had created an environment where Charlotte could rediscover her natural curiosity and confidence. The rigid schedule that had once dominated the princess's days had been replaced with a flexible routine that prioritized joy and discovery alongside education. Captain Marcus Blackwood had proven to be an inspired choice for overseeing Charlotte's recovery and education. His military background had initially concerned Victoria, but she quickly realized that Marcus possessed qualities that traditional educators often lacked: infinite patience, genuine respect for Charlotte's personality, and an ability to make learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. Under Marcus's guidance, Charlotte's education had been completely reimagined. Mathematics was taught through treasure hunts around the castle, where she had to solve problems to find clues leading to hidden surprises. History came alive through storytelling sessions in the library, where Marcus would act out famous battles and political negotiations, encouraging Charlotte to ask questions and imagine herself as different historical figures. Literature was explored through dramatic readings in the garden, with Charlotte taking on various character roles and discussing how different people might feel in challenging situations. The transformation in Charlotte's demeanor had been remarkable. The anxious, withdrawn child who had cried desperately for sleep that terrible night had gradually emerged as an enthusiastic learner who looked forward to each day's activities. Her laughter once again echoed through the castle corridors, and her natural curiosity had returned stronger than ever. Mrs. Pemberton had become an unofficial partner in Charlotte's education, teaching her practical skills in the kitchen while explaining the mathematics of cooking measurements and the science of baking. Thomas the gardener had introduced her to botany and biology through hands-on work in the castle gardens, where Charlotte had planted her own section of flowers and vegetables. Even some of the younger guards had been enlisted to teach Charlotte about different aspects of castle life and the kingdom's geography. On this particular morning, Charlotte was in the castle library with Captain Blackwood, working on a project that combined several subjects into one engaging activity. They were creating a detailed map of an imaginary kingdom, complete with geographical features, political boundaries, and historical events. Charlotte was lying on her stomach on a soft carpet, surrounded by colored pencils, reference books, and sheets of paper covered with her careful drawings. "Captain Marcus," Charlotte said, looking up from her work with excitement, "I think my kingdom should have a mountain range right here to protect it from invasion from the north. But I also want rivers for trade and transportation. How did real kingdoms figure out where to put their cities?" Marcus smiled at Charlotte's enthusiasm. Over the past 3 weeks, he had watched her blossom from a frightened, exhausted child into an engaged, confident learner. Her questions had become more complex and thoughtful, and she no longer apologized for not knowing something or for making mistakes. "That's an excellent question, Princess," Marcus replied, pulling out a map of their own kingdom. "Let's look at how Raven's Hollow developed over the centuries. See how our capital city is positioned near both the river and the mountain pass? That gave our ancestors access to water for drinking and trade, but also a strategic advantage for defense." Charlotte studied the map intently, tracing the rivers with her finger and asking follow-up questions about trade routes and military strategy. This was exactly the kind of natural learning that had been impossible under Miss Thornfield's rigid system. Charlotte wasn't memorizing facts to recite them back. She was developing genuine understanding and curiosity about how the world worked. Queen Victoria appeared in the library doorway, watching the lesson with a mixture of pride and relief. She had been worried that Charlotte's traumatic experience might permanently damage her love of learning, but Marcus had somehow managed to reignite her daughter's natural intellectual curiosity. "How are my favorite scholars doing this morning?" Victoria asked, entering the room and admiring Charlotte's colorful map. "Mama!" Charlotte jumped up and ran to hug her mother. "Look what I've made! It's the Kingdom of Sunhaven, and I've figured out where all the cities should go based on the geography and the trade routes. Captain Marcus has been teaching me about how real kingdoms developed." Victoria examined Charlotte's work with genuine admiration. The map showed remarkable thought and creativity, with careful attention to geographical logic and historical plausibility. More importantly, Charlotte's face glowed with pride and enthusiasm as she explained her reasoning for various design choices. "This is absolutely magnificent, sweetheart," Victoria said. "I can see you've put a lot of thought into every detail. Tell me about this city here by the lake.
Charlotte launched into an animated explanation of her imaginary kingdom's capital city, describing its industries, cultural features, and political structure with the kind of detailed enthusiasm that Miss Thornfield had tried to suppress as frivolous imagination. Marcus watched the interaction between mother and daughter with satisfaction.
One of his goals had been to help Charlotte regain confidence in her own ideas and opinions. Under the previous regime, she had been taught that her natural thoughts and questions were wrong or inappropriate. Now, she was learning to trust her own intelligence and creativity.
Captain Blackwood, Victoria said, I wanted to discuss Charlotte's progress with you and Edmund.
Would you be available for a meeting this afternoon? Of course, Your Majesty, Marcus replied. Princess Charlotte, would you like to continue working on your map, or shall we move on to our next activity? Charlotte looked at her project thoughtfully. I think I'd like to work on the map a bit more on my own, and then maybe we could read about real exploration expeditions later.
Perfect, Marcus said. Take all the time you need with the map, and we'll meet in the garden after lunch for our reading session.
As Charlotte settled back down with her colored pencils, Victoria and Marcus moved to a quiet corner of the library to speak privately. Marcus, Victoria said quietly, I cannot thank you enough for what you've done for Charlotte. The change in her over the past 3 weeks has been miraculous. Quote, and so far both of us could do what's true in fact. A scientist who ever despised his anticipator, she has remarkable resilience and intelligence. I've simply tried to create an environment where those qualities can flourish. Edmund told me about your innovative teaching methods, Victoria continued. The treasure hunt mathematics, the dramatic history lessons, the collaborative projects with the castle staff. It's exactly what Charlotte needed. She's learning more effectively than she ever did under the traditional approach. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I think Princess Charlotte learns best when she can see the practical applications of knowledge and when she feels like an active participant rather than a passive recipient of information. The previous methods treated her like an empty vessel, to be filled with facts, rather than a curious mind to be engaged and challenged. Victoria glanced over at Charlotte, who was completely absorbed in adding details to her imaginary kingdom. Have you given any thought to what her long-term education should look like? Edmund and I have been discussing the possibility of asking you to continue in this role permanently. Marcus felt a flutter of both honor and trepidation. I would be deeply honored to continue working with Princess Charlotte, but I want to make sure I'm truly the right choice for her long-term development. She will eventually need instruction in subjects that go beyond my expertise. That's actually one of the things we wanted to discuss with you this afternoon, Victoria said. We're envisioning a collaborative educational approach that combines your coordinating role with instruction from various specialists, but specialists who understand and respect the learning environment you've created. Before Marcus could respond, Charlotte called out from across the room. Mama, Captain Marcus, come look at this. I've figured out how to make my kingdom's economy work with different regions specializing in different products. Victoria and Marcus exchanged amused glances and went to examine Charlotte's latest innovation. The child had clearly been thinking about the economic principles they had discussed during previous lessons and had applied them creatively to her imaginary world. As the morning progressed, Charlotte continued to work on various projects while Victoria and Marcus discussed her progress and future plans. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, a stark contrast to the tense, fearful environment that had existed just weeks earlier. Around mid-morning, King Edmund joined them in the library, looking more relaxed and happy than he had in months. Seeing his daughter engaged in creative learning while surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being had lifted a tremendous weight from his shoulders. How are my 3 favorite people doing today? Edmund asked, settling into a chair near Charlotte's workspace. Papa! Charlotte looked up with a bright smile. I'm designing a whole kingdom, and it's going to be the best kingdom ever because I'm thinking about everything. The geography, the economy, the government, everything. Edmund examined his daughter's work with the same genuine interest that Victoria had shown. This is incredibly impressive, Charlotte. I can see you've learned a great deal about how kingdoms actually function. Charlotte beamed at her father's praise, then returned to her work with renewed enthusiasm. The contrast with her behavior under Miss Thornfield's regime was striking. Instead of seeking approval anxiously, she was simply enjoying her father's interest in her accomplishments. Edmund, Victoria said quietly. Marcus and I were just discussing Charlotte's long-term educational plans. I think we should finalize our conversation this afternoon and begin implementing the new structure as soon as possible.
Edmund nodded approvingly. I agree completely. Charlotte has thrived under Marcus's guidance, and I want to build on that success rather than risk disrupting it with unnecessary changes.
As the royal family continued their morning together, surrounded by books, maps, and the creative projects that had become Charlotte's new educational foundation, it was clear that the crisis of 3 weeks ago had ultimately led to something much better than what had existed before. The little princess who had once cried desperately in the middle of the night, pleading for someone to help her sleep, had been transformed into a confident, curious learner who looked forward to each new day. The royal guard, who had heard her cries and chose to act, had proven that sometimes the best educators are those who simply care enough to listen and respond with compassion. As Charlotte carefully added the final details to her imaginary kingdom, she looked up at the 3 adults who had helped make her world safe and joyful again. "I think," she announced with the wisdom of a child who had learned important lessons about trust and resilience, "that the most important thing about any kingdom is making sure everyone feels safe and happy. That's what makes people want to do their best." And in that moment, King Edmund, Queen Victoria, and Captain Marcus all knew that Charlotte was going to grow up to be exactly the kind of leader their kingdom needed. One who understood that true strength comes from compassion, and that the best way to bring out the best in people is to treat them with kindness and respect. The nightmare was over, and the real education had begun.